Picture this. It's a cold spring morning in 1703, and you're standing in the courtyard of Sengakuji Temple in Edo. The cherry blossoms are just beginning to bloom, their pale pink petals drifting down like snow. But the beauty of the scene is marred by something horrific. The ground beneath your feet is dark with blood, still fresh from the night before. You're not alone. Hundreds of people have gathered here, drawn by a story that will echo through the centuries. 46 men kneel in perfect formation before a simple grave, their faces serene despite what they're about to do. These are the famous 47 Ronin, masterless samurai, who have just completed their revenge against the man who caused their lord's death. If you use these videos to fall asleep, subscribe so you don't miss any new ones. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the video and any suggestions you have for future ones. Now, having fulfilled their duty, they must pay the ultimate price. The youngest among them is barely 16 years old. Oishi Chikara has his whole life ahead of him, but in a few moments, he will plunge a tanto deep into his belly and draw it across in the ritual cut that will spill his intestines onto the temple stones. His father, the leader of this doomed band, kneels beside him with the same calm expression. This is the reality of samurai life. Not the glorious adventure that movies and books would have you believe, but a trap of honor, violence, and death that once snared you, rarely let you go. The 47 Ronin became legends precisely because their story captures the impossible demands placed on every samurai. Absolute loyalty, even unto death, honor that could only be maintained through suicide, and a code so rigid that it turned men into prisoners of their own social class. As you watch these men prepare to die, you begin to understand a fundamental truth that history has largely forgotten. Being a samurai in feudal Japan was not a privilege to be envied, but a burden so heavy that many who bore it were crushed beneath its weight. The story of why you wouldn't want to be a samurai begins not with war or violence, but with something far more insidious. The very system that created and sustained the warrior class. Imagine being born into a family where your entire life path was predetermined before you drew your first breath. Your profession, your social interactions, even whom you would marry, all decided by an accident of birth that you had no control over. The Tokugawa shogunate, established in 1615, created what appeared to be a privileged position for samurai at the top of Japan's social hierarchy. But this apparent privilege came with chains that bound every aspect of a samurai's existence. The rigid four-class system, samurai, farmers, artisans, merchants, wasn't just a social arrangement. It was a prison that locked people into their birth station with no possibility of escape. Consider the psychological weight of this system. You were told from childhood that you are superior to everyone below you in the hierarchy, yet you have absolutely no control over your own life. You cannot choose your profession. You must be a warrior. You cannot choose where to live. You must reside in the castle town assigned to your lord. You cannot choose your spouse. Marriages must serve political purposes and require domain approval. You cannot even choose your clothing. Sumptuary laws dictate exactly what colors and fabrics are appropriate for your rank. But perhaps most crushing of all, you cannot choose to leave. Unlike the merchant class, which could accumulate wealth and sometimes even buy their way into samurai families, there was no legal path for a samurai to renounce their status and become something else. You were trapped in the warrior class for life, regardless of your aptitude, interest, or desire for a different existence. The financial reality of samurai life reveals the first great contradiction of their supposedly privileged status. While merchants grew wealthy, and farmers could at least own their land, Samurai were entirely dependent on rice stipends paid by their lords. This dependency created a vulnerability that would plague the warrior class for centuries. The system was designed during wartime, when military service justified these payments. But as Japan entered the long peace of the Edo period, samurai found themselves in the bizarre position of being professional soldiers in a society that no longer needed professional soldiers. Their stipends continued, but their purpose evaporated, leaving them as expensive ornaments in an increasingly commercial society. The rice stipend system was inherently unstable. Your income fluctuated with rice prices, which could vary wildly based on weather, politics, and market conditions. When rice prices fell, your purchasing power collapsed overnight, but you had no recourse, no alternative source of income, no ability to negotiate, no escape from the system that bound you. Worse still, as the Edo period progressed, inflation began to eat away at samurai wealth like a slow poison. The prices of goods, services, and manufactured items rose steadily, but samurai stipends remained fixed at traditional levels. By the 18th century, many domains were so financially strained that they could only pay half of promised stipends, effectively cutting samurai incomes in half, while their expenses continued to rise. The psychological impact of this economic decline cannot be overstated. Imagine being told your entire life that you are part of Japan's elite warrior class, only to find yourself borrowing money from merchants, people supposedly beneath you in the social hierarchy. This wasn't just financial hardship. It was a fundamental attack on samurai identity and self-worth. Many samurai secretly took up manual labor, crafts, or farming to survive, activities that were not only illegal for their class but deeply shameful. Some sold their samurai status to wealthy merchants, allowing commoners to be adopted into warrior families in exchange for money to pay debts. These practices undermined the very foundations of the system that supposedly elevated samurai above all other classes. If economic hardship was the slow poison that weakened samurai society, then the institutionalized culture of death was the sword that hung perpetually over every warrior's neck. The practice of seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, wasn't merely an option for disgraced samurai. It was often a legal requirement, a form of capital punishment disguised as honor. The ritual itself was designed to be as psychologically devastating as it was physically agonizing. Seppuku required the victim to use a tanto or wakizashi to cut open their abdomen horizontally, often followed by a vertical cut, while remaining conscious and maintaining composure. The process could take agonizing minutes as the victim slowly bled to death, their intestines spilling onto the ground before them. Consider the case recorded by British diplomat Bertram Freeman Mitford in his book, Tales of Old Japan. He describes witnessing a young samurai who, not content with giving himself the one necessary cut, slashed himself thrice horizontally and twice vertically. Then he stabbed himself in the throat until the dirk protruded on the other side, with its sharp edge to the front. Setting his teeth in one supreme effort, he drove the knife forward with both hands through his throat and fell dead. This wasn't considered unusual or extreme. It was viewed as admirable dedication to the ritual. The expectation wasn't simply that you would die, but that you would die in the most painful way possible, while maintaining perfect composure and demonstrating your commitment to samurai values. But the psychological horror of seppuku extended far beyond the physical act. From childhood, every samurai lived with the knowledge that numerous circumstances could require them to take their own life. Losing a battle, failing their lord, being dishonored, or simply being ordered to do so as punishment for various offenses. Perhaps most devastating was the way seppuku spread through families like a deadly contagion. When a samurai committed ritual suicide, family members often felt obligated to follow suit, creating cascading tragedies that could wipe out entire lineages. The historical record is filled with examples of mass family suicides. During the fall of the Aizu domain in 1869, the family of Saigo Tanomo, a senior retainer who survived the conflict, lost 22 women to honor suicide. His elderly mother, his wife, his daughters, and even his 2-year-old granddaughter all died by their own hands rather than face the shame of defeat. These weren't isolated incidents, but systematic tragedies that occurred throughout samurai history. The women of Aizu chose death over the possibility of capture and rape by enemy forces, but they also died because the samurai code demanded that family honor be preserved at all costs, even if that cost was the lives of innocent children. One of the most heartbreaking examples of how the samurai death cult destroyed young lives is the story of the Byakutai, the White Tiger Unit, 20 teenage boys who died needlessly in the final days of the Tokugawa shogunate. These boys, aged 16 and 17, were the sons of samurai families from the Aizu domain. Trained as soldiers despite their youth, they found themselves fighting against the new Meiji government's forces in 1868. During the battle for their home city, they became separated from the main force and made their way to Imori Hill, where they could see smoke rising from their castle town. Believing their lord had been killed and their families slaughtered, these teenagers made a decision that reveals the terrible psychology of samurai honor. Rather than investigate further or attempt to rejoin their forces, they knelt in a circle and began committing seppuku. One by one, 19 boys plunged their short swords into their bellies, their young blood soaking into the earth as they died for a cause that was already lost. Only one, Inuma Sadakichi, survived long enough to be rescued by a peasant who found him among the corpses of his friends. The tragedy is multiplied when you realize what they died for: a misunderstanding. The smoke they saw was not from the destruction of their castle, but from ordinary fires in the town. Their lord was alive, their family safe, and their cause, while doomed, was not yet completely lost. 20 teenagers died because they had been so thoroughly indoctrinated in the samurai death cult that suicide seemed preferable to the possibility of dishonor. While the threat of mandatory suicide created a culture of death within samurai families, the practice of kirisut gomen, literally authorization to cut and leave, extended that culture of violence into every interaction between samurai and the lower classes. Kirisut gomen gave every samurai the legal right to kill any person of lower social status for perceived disrespect, without warning, without trial, and without consequence. This wasn't a theoretical right that existed only on paper. It was actively used throughout the feudal period, creating a climate of terror that poisoned social relations and trapped samurai in cycles of violence. The practice was justified by the supposed need to maintain social order and respect for the samurai class. But in reality, it created a system where life and death depended on the mood and judgment of armed men who had been trained from childhood to solve problems with swords. Consider how this affected your daily life as a samurai. Every interaction with a commoner carried the potential for violence. A farmer who didn't bow low enough, a merchant who spoke too boldly, a child who stared too long. Any of these could be interpreted as disrespectful, creating a justification for murder. But once you killed someone under kirisut gomen, you were expected to report the incident to authorities, who would investigate to ensure the killing was truly justified. This created enormous psychological pressure. You couldn't simply ignore perceived slights. Doing so would be seen as weakness and could itself be grounds for losing honor. But you also couldn't kill people casually, as unjustified killings could result in punishment. You were trapped between the expectations of your violent class and the legal requirements of the system that enabled that violence. The psychological toll of living in this system was enormous. Historical records show that many samurai became desensitized to violence, viewing the lives of commoners as essentially worthless. Some developed a casual attitude toward killing that would be recognized today as sociopathic behavior. The practice of tsujigiri, crossroads killing, provides a particularly chilling example of how this culture of violence corrupted samurai psychology. Some samurai would position themselves at crossroads at night and kill random passers-by to test new swords or practice their cutting technique. These weren't acts of passion or honor. They were premeditated murders committed for sport or training. Yet even these murders were often overlooked by authorities, as they occurred in a society that had normalized samurai violence against commoners. The message was clear. The life of a peasant or merchant was worth less than a samurai's momentary whim. Perhaps most troubling was how this culture of violence became inseparable from samurai identity. You weren't just permitted to kill. You were expected to be ready to kill at any moment, to view violence as the primary solution to problems, and to measure your worth by your willingness to die or kill for abstract concepts of honor. This created a feedback loop where violence bred more violence. Young samurai were trained not just in sword techniques, but in the mindset of violence. The assumption that conflicts should be resolved through combat, that honor was more important than life, and that death was preferable to shame. The psychological damage this caused was enormous, but rarely acknowledged. Historical records hint at what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and other mental health issues among samurai who had been exposed to constant violence. But the culture provided no outlet for these feelings. Expressing fear, trauma, or reluctance to fight was itself a form of dishonor that could lead to social ostracism or death. If the samurai system was a trap for those within it, the fate of Ronin, masterless samurai, reveals what happened to those who fell through its cracks. The word Ronin literally means wave man, suggesting someone tossed about by forces beyond their control. And no metaphor could be more accurate for describing their desperate circumstances. The scale of the Ronin problem reveals just how unstable and cruel the samurai system really was. At the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, an estimated 400,000 samurai found themselves masterless overnight when their lords were defeated or killed. Imagine, in a single day, nearly 500,000 trained warriors were cast out of the only social system they had ever known, with no skills applicable to peaceful society and no legal way to support themselves. But Sekigahara was just the beginning. Throughout the Edo period, the number of Ronin continued to grow as domains were abolished. Lords died without heirs. Samurai were dismissed for various offenses, or economic pressures forced daimyo to reduce their retainer forces. By the mid-17th century, the Ronin population had swelled to over 500,000 people, an army of displaced, desperate, and often bitter former warriors who posed a constant threat to social stability. The government recognized this danger, leading to policies that made the Ronin situation even worse by restricting where they could live, what work they could do, and whether they could serve new masters. The daily reality of Ronin life was one of grinding poverty and social humiliation. Cut off from their rice stipends, former samurai were forced to find other ways to survive, but their options were severely limited by both law and prejudice. Many Ronin took up manual crafts. The historical record is full of references to former warriors making umbrellas, or doing other simple handicrafts to earn enough money for basic survival. But this work was not only poorly paid, it was deeply shameful for men who had been raised to believe they were members of Japan's warrior elite. Others turned to teaching, becoming wandering tutors who offered instruction in reading, writing, or martial arts to anyone who could pay. This was more respectable than manual labor, but it was also unstable and poorly compensated. A Ronin teacher might go days without students, sleeping rough and begging for food. Some of the more fortunate Ronin found work as bodyguards for wealthy merchants, or as guards for trade caravans. But even this employment was precarious and demeaning. They were essentially using their skills as killers to protect the very merchant class that the samurai system ranked as the lowest in society. For many Ronin, the temptation to turn to crime was overwhelming. They were trained killers with no legitimate way to use their skills, living in poverty in a society that looked down on them with a mixture of fear and contempt. Some became bandits, preying on travelers and merchant caravans. Others joined organized crime syndicates in cities, working as enforcers for gambling rings, brothels, and protection rackets. Many became simple muggers and thieves, using their sword skills to rob people who had what they needed to survive. The historical record shows that Ronin involvement in crime was so widespread that it became a major social problem throughout the Edo period. Towns and cities had to maintain special patrols to deal with Ronin gangs, and merchants traveled in armed groups to protect themselves from desperate former samurai. But perhaps most tragically, some Ronin turned to suicide as their only escape from poverty and shame. Lord Redesdale recorded meeting a Ronin who came to the graves of the 47 Ronin to kill himself, leaving a note explaining that he had tried to enter service with various daimyo, but had been refused. Rather than continue living as a masterless warrior, he chose death at the site associated with samurai loyalty and honor. The story of the 47 Ronin, celebrated in Japanese culture as the ultimate example of samurai loyalty, actually illustrates the terrible trap that honor culture created for masterless warriors. When their lord Asano Naganori was forced to commit seppuku in 1701 after attacking a court official, his retainers found themselves in an impossible position. As Ronin, they had no official standing and no legal recourse against their lord's enemy, Kira Yoshinaka. But as samurai, they were bound by the code of loyalty that demanded they avenge their master's death. For nearly 2 years, they planned their revenge while living in poverty and disgrace, many of them taking up menial jobs and enduring social humiliation. When they finally killed Kira in 1703, they knew they were signing their own death warrants. The government couldn't allow their act of revenge to go unpunished, but public opinion supported the Ronin's loyalty to their dead master. The compromise solution, ordering them to commit seppuku rather than executing them as criminals, was presented as a mercy, but it still meant death for all 46 survivors. The youngest, Oishi Chikara, was only 16 when he died. He had spent nearly a third of his short life as a Ronin, living in poverty and planning a revenge that he knew would kill him. This is what the samurai honor system demanded of its adherents, not just loyalty, but loyalty unto death, even when that death served no practical purpose. While Ronin faced the immediate catastrophe of losing their place in society, samurai who retained their positions faced a different but equally devastating economic reality. The stipend system that theoretically guaranteed their livelihood actually trapped them in a cycle of poverty that grew worse with each passing decade. The economic foundation of samurai life rested on payments of rice that were measured in koku, roughly the amount needed to feed one person for a year. This system worked reasonably well during the early years of Tokugawa rule, But as Japan's economy became more sophisticated and monetized, it created increasingly severe problems for the warrior class. The fundamental issue was that rice stipends were fixed at traditional levels, while everything else became more expensive. As commerce expanded and cities grew, the prices of manufactured goods, services, and luxury items rose steadily. But samurai income remained locked at levels determined by centuries-old precedents, creating a scissors effect that steadily impoverished the warrior class. By the 18th century, many samurai found that their stipends could no longer support what was considered a minimally acceptable lifestyle for their class. They were expected to maintain certain standards of dress, housing, and behavior, but they lacked the income to do so. This created a painful choice: violate class expectations by living like commoners, or go into debt to maintain appearances. Most samurai chose debt, borrowing money from the merchant class they theoretically outranked. This created a humiliating reversal of the social hierarchy. Warriors who were supposed to be Japan's elite found themselves begging for loans from people they considered social inferiors. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine being told your entire life that merchants are the lowest class in society, then finding yourself so financially desperate that you must grovel before them for money. Many samurai reported feeling ashamed to show their faces in public, knowing that their creditors and everyone else knew the truth about their financial situation. Worse still, the debt often became hereditary. Samurai families would borrow against future stipend payments, creating obligations that their children and grandchildren would inherit. Some families became so indebted that their entire stipends went directly to creditors, leaving them with no cash income at all. By the late Edo period, studies suggest that 80 to 85% of samurai families were in debt, with many owing amounts that exceeded their annual income by several years. This wasn't just financial hardship. It was systemic impoverishment of an entire social class that was supposedly privileged and elite. What made the economic trap particularly cruel was that samurai were legally prohibited from pursuing most of the obvious solutions to their financial problems. They couldn't engage in commerce, which was the most profitable sector of the economy. They couldn't own land independently, which would have provided income security. They couldn't change professions or move to areas with better economic opportunities. Some samurai secretly violated these restrictions, taking up farming, crafts, or trade under assumed names or through intermediaries. But these activities had to be hidden, adding the stress of potential discovery and punishment to the challenges of learning new skills and building new businesses. Others sold their samurai status to wealthy merchants who wanted the social prestige and legal privileges that came with warrior rank. This practice, while profitable for desperate samurai, further undermined the foundations of the class system and contributed to its eventual collapse. The economic pressures created psychological strains that affected every aspect of samurai life. Historical records hint at widespread depression, anxiety, and family dysfunction among warrior families, struggling with poverty. Parents who couldn't afford to provide proper educations for their children faced the prospect of seeing the next generation fall even further in social status. Marriages became financial calculations rather than personal relationships, as families sought partners who could bring economic advantages rather than love or compatibility. Many samurai reported feeling trapped and hopeless, unable to escape their circumstances but also unable to accept them. The honor culture that supposedly defined their identity made it impossible to acknowledge their problems openly or seek help from others. They were expected to maintain dignity and composure, even as their world crumbled around them. Beyond the economic and psychological pressures, samurai faced significant health challenges that further reduced their quality of life and life expectancy. The combination of poor medical knowledge, endemic diseases, and the physical toll of constant stress created health conditions that would be shocking by modern standards. Healthcare in feudal Japan was primitive by contemporary standards, relying primarily on traditional Chinese medicine and folk remedies that were often ineffective against serious illnesses. Samurai, despite their supposedly privileged status, had access to the same limited medical knowledge as everyone else, with similar results. Historical analysis of skeletal remains from the medieval period shows that the highest mortality among young adults occurred during this time, with early age at death being the result of poor community health, violent death, and frequent large-scale natural catastrophes. This suggests that even elite warriors faced significant health challenges that frequently proved fatal. Epidemic diseases periodically swept through Japan, killing samurai and commoners alike. Leprosy, smallpox, beriberi, and other conditions spread rapidly through castle towns where samurai lived in close quarters. The lack of understanding about disease transmission meant that these epidemics often devastated entire communities before burning themselves out. Even during peaceful periods, samurai faced significant risks of injury and death from training accidents, duels, and the various forms of sanctioned violence that permeated their culture. Sword training was inherently dangerous, and the pressure to demonstrate skill and courage led many young warriors to take unnecessary risks. Historical records describe training sessions where serious injuries were common, and where the cultural expectation was that warriors should endure pain without complaint. This created a culture where medical treatment was often delayed or refused, leading to complications that could have been prevented with proper care. The psychological trauma of constant exposure to violence also took its toll, though this was rarely acknowledged or treated. Samurai were expected to witness and participate in executions, torture, and other forms of brutality as part of their duties. The cumulative effect of this exposure created what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but the culture provided no framework for understanding or addressing these problems. The psychological pressures of samurai life, the constant threat of violence, the financial stress, the impossible demands of the honor code, created chronic stress that manifested in physical symptoms. Historical records hint at widespread problems, with insomnia, digestive issues, and other conditions that we now know are often stress-related. The rigid behavioral expectations placed on samurai made it difficult for them to express emotions or seek help for mental health problems. They were expected to maintain stoic composure at all times, which prevented healthy processing of trauma and stress. This emotional suppression likely contributed to both mental and physical health problems. Some samurai turned to alcohol as a way of coping with stress, creating additional health problems. Others became obsessed with death and suicide, viewing these as preferable to continued suffering. The culture's emphasis on dying well actually encouraged some warriors to give up on life, rather than seeking solutions to their problems. The samurai honor system didn't just trap individual warriors. It created a web of obligations and expectations that ensnared entire families in cycles of violence, sacrifice, and tragedy. The very concept of family honor meant that the actions of any individual could doom their relatives, while the duty to maintain that honor often required family members to choose death over disgrace. For samurai, marriage was never a personal choice, but always a political and economic calculation designed to strengthen family alliances and improve social standing. Young people had no say in selecting their spouses. These decisions were made by family heads and domain authorities based on strategic considerations. The lack of personal choice in such an intimate relationship created enormous psychological stress. Historical records show that many samurai marriages were loveless arrangements, where spouses barely knew each other and had no emotional connection. This dysfunction at the heart of family life contributed to broader social and psychological problems within the warrior class. Women in samurai families faced particularly harsh restrictions. They were expected to embody the honor of their households while having virtually no control over their own lives. A samurai wife who failed to maintain proper behavior could bring shame on her entire family, potentially leading to loss of status, financial ruin, or worse. The arranged marriage system also created practical problems. Matches were often made based on political considerations rather than compatibility, leading to households marked by conflict and unhappiness. Children grew up in these dysfunctional environments, learning to see family relationships as sources of obligation and stress rather than love and support. Perhaps most tragic was how the honor system turned children into hostages to their parents' reputation and behavior. From birth, samurai children carried the burden of family honor. They were expected to uphold standards they had no role in creating and could face death for failures they couldn't prevent. The story of the Byakutai illustrates this dynamic perfectly. These teenage boys died not for their own failures, but because they believed their families and lord had been disgraced. Their suicide was seen as noble, precisely because it demonstrated their willingness to die for honor that belonged to others. But the Byakutai were not unique. Throughout samurai history, children regularly died for their parents' mistakes or their family's misfortunes. When a samurai was ordered to commit seppuku, his children often felt obligated to follow suit. When a domain was defeated in war, entire families would choose mass suicide rather than face the shame of survival. The honor system created a psychological dynamic where individual sacrifice demanded reciprocal sacrifice from others. When one family member chose death over disgrace, relatives often felt compelled to make similar choices to avoid the appearance of caring less about honor. The historical record is filled with examples of cascading family suicides that began with one person's death and spread through entire households. The family of Saigo Tanomo lost 22 women to honor suicide during the fall of Aizu Domain. Grandmothers, mothers, daughters, and even toddlers all died because the culture demanded that family honor be preserved at all costs. These mass suicides were praised by contemporary observers as demonstrations of loyalty and honor. But from a modern perspective, they represent a form of collective madness. A culture so obsessed with abstract concepts of honor that it was willing to sacrifice the lives of innocent children to maintain them. The financial pressures faced by samurai families added another layer of dysfunction to already strained relationships. Parents who couldn't provide for their children felt shame that affected every aspect of family life. Children who saw their parents struggling with debt and poverty grew up with anxiety about their own futures and their family's stability. The practice of selling samurai status to wealthy merchants created particularly bitter family dynamics. Parents who had to make these arrangements often felt they were betraying everything they had been taught to value, while children who inherited the consequences of these decisions grew up with complicated feelings about their own identity and worth. Some families were torn apart by disagreements about how to respond to economic pressures. Older family members who had grown up in more prosperous times often refused to accept the changes necessary for survival, while younger family members chafed against restrictions that seemed increasingly meaningless in the face of poverty and hardship. One of the most ironic aspects of samurai life was how the long peace of the Edo period, ostensibly a blessing for Japanese society, created existential problems for the warrior class that proved impossible to solve. The Tokugawa shogunate's success in ending civil warfare and creating political stability meant that samurai found themselves in the bizarre position of being professional soldiers in a society that no longer needed professional soldiers. Their entire identity was built around martial prowess and military service, but these skills became increasingly irrelevant as decades of peace stretched into centuries. Imagine training your entire life for a career that suddenly no longer exists. That's what happened to generations of samurai who inherited warrior status, but had no wars to fight, no enemies to defeat, and no military purpose to fulfill. They were trapped in a social role that had become obsolete, but they had no legal way to transition to something more relevant. The psychological impact was devastating. Samurai were raised with stories of their ancestors' military exploits and taught to see themselves as the heirs to a glorious warrior tradition. But their own lives consisted of bureaucratic duties, ceremonial functions, and endless training for battles that would never come. Many samurai reported feeling like actors playing roles in a historical drama, rather than authentic warriors serving a real purpose. They went through the motions of military preparedness, maintaining weapons, practicing martial arts, studying military strategy. But everyone understood that these activities were essentially theatrical performances rather than professional necessities. As their military functions disappeared, many samurai were pressed into bureaucratic service, becoming administrators, clerks, and record keepers for their domains. But this transition created new problems that further undermined warrior identity and self-worth. Bureaucratic work required different skills than military service: literacy, numeracy, attention to detail, and patience with routine tasks. Many samurai lacked these skills or found them deeply incompatible with their self-image as warriors. They struggled with work that seemed boring, meaningless, and inconsistent with their supposed elite status. The bureaucratic hierarchy also created conflicts with traditional samurai values. Success in administration required compromise, flexibility, and willingness to work within complex systems, qualities that could conflict with the warrior ideals of honor, directness, and personal courage. Some samurai excelled in their new roles and found satisfaction in administrative work, but many others felt diminished by the transition, seeing themselves as failed warriors who had been reduced to pushing papers and counting rice. Perhaps most painful was the growing sense that samurai culture itself was becoming obsolete in an increasingly commercial and peaceful society. The values that defined warrior identity, martial prowess, readiness for death, loyalty to feudal lords, seemed increasingly irrelevant to the practical needs of a society focused on trade, agriculture, and peaceful prosperity. Merchants, supposedly the lowest class in the social hierarchy, were becoming the most important people in actual economic terms. Their skills in finance, trade, and commerce were driving Japan's prosperity, while samurai skills in warfare and combat served no practical purpose. This created a profound identity crisis that affected the entire warrior class. Samurai were supposed to be Japan's elite, but they increasingly felt like relics from an earlier age. Expensive museum pieces, maintained for traditional reasons rather than practical necessity. The cultural obsession with death and honor that had once served military purposes became increasingly dysfunctional in peaceful times. The readiness to die that was useful in battle became a liability in a society that needed people willing to live, work, and build for the future. For some samurai, becoming ronin, masterless warriors, actually seemed preferable to the alternatives offered by peaceful society. At least as Ronin, they could maintain some connection to the warrior ideals they valued, even if it meant poverty and social ostracism. But the Ronin option was itself a symptom of the deeper problem. The samurai system had created a class of people who couldn't function effectively in the peaceful, commercial society that Japan was becoming. They were trained for a world that no longer existed and couldn't adapt to the world that did exist. The growing Ronin population represented not just individual tragedies, but a systemic failure of the feudal system to provide meaningful roles for its own elite class. These were people who had been told they were superior to everyone else in society, but who found themselves increasingly unable to contribute anything of value to that society. The mental health consequences of samurai life were perhaps the most devastating aspect of warrior existence, though they were rarely acknowledged or discussed in historical records. The combination of impossible behavioral standards, constant stress, and cultural prohibition against expressing vulnerability created psychological conditions that would be recognized today as severely unhealthy. The code of Bushido, the supposed way of the warrior, created behavioral expectations that were psychologically impossible to maintain consistently. The 7 virtues of Bushido: justice, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and loyalty sound admirable in theory, but in practice they created standards that no human being could meet without severe psychological damage. Consider the virtue of courage, which required samurai to show no fear in the face of death or danger. This wasn't just about battlefield bravery. It extended to every aspect of life, creating an expectation that warriors should never display anxiety, worry, or concern about anything. The psychological pressure of maintaining this facade was enormous, especially for people living under constant threats to their lives, fortunes, and social status. The virtue of loyalty demanded absolute devotion to one's lord, even when that lord was incompetent, cruel, or corrupt. Samurai were expected to carry out orders without question, and to place their lord's interests above their own welfare and that of their families. This created moral conflicts that had no good resolution and psychological stress that could not be acknowledged or discussed. The emphasis on honor required samurai to be constantly vigilant about their reputation and ready to defend it with violence. This created a state of chronic hypervigilance that would be recognized today as a symptom of anxiety disorders. Every social interaction carried the potential for conflict, and every conflict carried the potential for death. Perhaps most damaging was the cultural expectation that samurai should suppress all emotions, except anger and martial enthusiasm. Fear, sadness, anxiety, grief, and even joy were seen as weaknesses that undermined warrior effectiveness. Samurai were taught to maintain stoic composure at all times, regardless of their internal emotional state. This emotional suppression prevented healthy processing of trauma and stress. When samurai witnessed violence, experienced loss, or faced frightening situations, they were expected to show no reaction and seek no support from others. The cumulative effect of this emotional isolation was severe psychological damage that manifested in various forms of dysfunction. Some samurai became obsessed with death and suicide, viewing these as preferable to continued emotional suffering. Others developed what we would now recognize as dissociative disorders, becoming emotionally numb and disconnected from their own experiences. Still others turned to alcohol, violence, or other destructive behaviors as ways of coping with psychological pain they couldn't acknowledge or address. The samurai version of masculinity was particularly toxic, requiring men to demonstrate their worth through violence, dominance, and emotional invulnerability. Any sign of weakness, vulnerability, or human emotion was seen as a failure of masculinity that could result in social ostracism or worse. This created enormous pressure on young men who were naturally sensitive, intellectual, or peaceful by temperament. They were forced to adopt personas that were fundamentally incompatible with their personalities, creating internal conflicts that could never be resolved within the framework of samurai culture. The emphasis on martial prowess as the primary measure of masculine worth also created problems for samurai, who were more naturally suited to other pursuits. A warrior who showed talent for poetry, scholarship, or artistic endeavors faced social pressure to suppress these interests in favor of military training, even during periods when military skills served no practical purpose. The psychological pressures of samurai life manifested in various forms of mental illness that were poorly understood and inadequately treated. Historical records hint at widespread depression, anxiety, and other psychological disorders among the warrior class, though these were rarely identified as medical problems. Many samurai reported chronic insomnia, nightmares, and other sleep disturbances that we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Others developed obsessive-compulsive behaviors related to honor, cleanliness, or ritual observance. Some became socially isolated, unable to maintain relationships with family members or friends. The suicide rate among samurai was extraordinarily high, even by historical standards. While this was often portrayed as noble sacrifice for honor, many cases appear to have been responses to psychological suffering that seemed unbearable and had no other outlet within the cultural framework. The lack of understanding about mental health meant that samurai, who were struggling psychologically, had no resources for help. They couldn't acknowledge their problems without losing face, couldn't seek treatment that didn't exist, and couldn't escape the cultural pressures that were causing their suffering. While the focus on samurai life typically centers on male warriors, the women of samurai families faced their own unique set of impossible burdens that were often even more restrictive and dangerous than those faced by their male relatives. Samurai women lived in what can only be described as an invisible prison, bound by restrictions that controlled every aspect of their existence while receiving none of the supposed privileges that came with warrior status. They were expected to embody family honor while having no power to protect or defend it through their own actions. Unlike male samurai, who could at least theoretically influence their fate through martial prowess or political maneuvering, women were entirely dependent on the actions and decisions of their male relatives. Their honor, safety, and survival depended on circumstances completely beyond their control. Yet they faced the same deadly consequences for failure that their husbands and fathers did. The education provided to samurai women focused almost entirely on domestic duties and moral instruction designed to make them better servants to their families. While some women received training in martial arts, primarily to enable them to commit suicide effectively when necessary, they were generally denied the intellectual development that might have allowed them to understand or influence their circumstances. Perhaps most horrific was the expectation that samurai women should choose death over dishonor, not just for their own actions, but for circumstances completely beyond their control. The mass suicides of women during military conflicts were praised as demonstrations of virtue, but they represented a systematic destruction of entire generations of mothers, daughters, and children. During the fall of Aizu Domain in 1869, nearly 200 women died by suicide, rather than face potential capture by enemy forces. These deaths were celebrated as noble sacrifices, but they included grandmothers, mothers, and children as young as 2 years old, who died because the honor system demanded that family reputation be preserved at all costs. The women of samurai families were taught from childhood that their lives were less valuable than their family's honor. They practiced methods of suicide, typically cutting the arteries in their necks, with the same dedication that their male relatives practiced sword techniques. Their education literally prepared them to die rather than to live. For samurai women, marriage was not a partnership, but a form of transfer from one male authority to another. They had no choice in selecting spouses, and no recourse if those marriages proved abusive or unhappy. Their primary function was to produce male heirs, and to serve as symbols of their family's honor and status. The arranged marriage system created households where women were essentially prisoners, bound to serve husbands they might not know and certainly hadn't chosen. Many historical accounts describe samurai marriages as cold, formal relationships where emotional connection was discouraged and personal happiness was considered irrelevant. Women who failed to produce male heirs faced social pressure and often divorce, which typically meant returning to their birth families in disgrace. Those who did have children found that their relationships with those children were heavily mediated by formal expectations and honor requirements that prevented natural emotional expression. A small number of samurai women managed to escape some of these restrictions by becoming onabugeisha, female warriors who were trained in martial arts and sometimes participated in combat. But even these exceptions proved the rule, as their warrior status was typically temporary and existed only during periods of extreme crisis when normal social restrictions broke down. The most famous example is Nakano Takeko, who fought against imperial forces during the fall of Aizu Domain and was killed in battle. Her story is often cited as evidence of women's agency within samurai culture, but it actually demonstrates the opposite. She died at age 21 in a hopeless battle, and her primary legacy is that her sister risked her own life to retrieve Takeko's severed head, to prevent it from being dishonored by enemies. Even the onabugeisha were expected to prioritize death over defeat or capture. Their martial training was as much about enabling effective suicide as it was about combat effectiveness. They were taught to fight, but they were also taught that their ultimate duty was to die rather than survive defeat. By the mid-19th century, the contradictions and dysfunction of the samurai system had reached a breaking point. The arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853 exposed the military inadequacy of Japan's warrior class, while internal pressures had already made their social and economic position unsustainable. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 represented not just a change in government, but a recognition that the samurai system had become an obstacle to Japan's survival and prosperity. The new government moved quickly to dismantle the legal framework that had sustained the warrior class for centuries, effectively abolishing samurai as a social category. The logic was brutal but undeniable. Japan needed to modernize rapidly to avoid colonization by Western powers, and the samurai system was incompatible with the social and economic changes that modernization required. The warrior class, that had once been Japan's military elite, had become a parasitic drain on national resources, an expensive, unproductive social layer that contributed nothing to the country's defense or prosperity. The abolition of the samurai class was accomplished through a series of reforms that systematically stripped away the legal privileges and financial support that had sustained warrior families. The sword-carrying privilege was eliminated, making it illegal for former samurai to bear their traditional weapons. The stipend system was abolished, cutting off the rice payments that had been samurai families' primary source of income. Some samurai attempted armed resistance to these changes, leading to conflicts like the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, where traditional warriors armed with swords and spears faced modern soldiers equipped with rifles and artillery. The outcome was predictable. The samurai were slaughtered by the hundreds, their traditional weapons and fighting methods proving utterly inadequate against modern military technology. The Satsuma Rebellion revealed the final truth about the samurai. They were not actually elite warriors, but rather products of a social system that had prioritized ceremony and tradition over practical military effectiveness. When faced with real combat against competent opponents using modern weapons, they proved to be worse than useless. They were obstacles to effective military organization and strategy. The samurai who survived the Meiji Restoration faced a particularly cruel fate. They had to live in a world that had definitively proven their obsolescence. Some managed to adapt, using their literacy and administrative experience to find new careers in the emerging modern economy. But many others struggled to adjust to a society that no longer had any use for their skills or values. The psychological impact on former samurai was severe. They had been raised to believe they were members of Japan's elite warrior class, only to discover that they were actually impediments to their country's progress. Their entire identity had been built around a social role that had become not just irrelevant, but actively harmful to the society they had claimed to serve. Some former samurai turned to crime or political extremism, unable to accept the changes that had destroyed their world. Others sank into depression and despair, feeling betrayed by a society that had once honored them, but now dismissed them as relics of a backward past. As you stand in that temple courtyard, watching the 47 Ronin prepare for their ritual deaths, you begin to understand the true horror of what you're witnessing. These men are not heroes choosing glorious sacrifice. They are victims of a system so dysfunctional that it turned loyalty into a death sentence and honor into a prison. The story of the samurai is not the romantic tale of noble warriors living privileged lives that popular culture would have you believe. It is the story of a social class trapped by its own mythology, destroyed by contradictions it could never resolve, and finally revealed as an obstacle to the very society it claimed to protect. Every aspect of samurai existence, from the economic dependence that made them vulnerable to political manipulation, to the honor culture that demanded death as the solution to every problem, to the rigid social restrictions that prevented adaptation to changing circumstances, created suffering for those caught within the system. The violence that defined samurai culture wasn't noble or heroic, but rather a symptom of a society that had lost the ability to solve problems through peaceful means. The constant threat of mandatory suicide wasn't evidence of spiritual discipline, but rather proof of a culture so rigid that it preferred death to change. The economic poverty that plagued most samurai wasn't a temporary hardship, but rather the inevitable result of a system that prevented its own members from engaging productively with their society's economy. Perhaps most tragically, the samurai system destroyed not just those who rebelled against it, but also those who served it most faithfully. The 47 Ronin died not because they were bad samurai, but because they were such good ones that they couldn't recognize the system's fundamental dysfunction. Their loyalty was real, their courage was genuine, and their sacrifice was absolute. But none of these virtues could overcome the fact that they were serving a social order that had become actively harmful to human flourishing. The women and children who died in mass family suicides weren't weak or cowardly. They were responding rationally to a system that offered them no viable alternatives. The Ronin who turned to crime or suicide weren't moral failures. They were victims of economic and social policies that made honest survival impossible. The samurai who struggled with depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems weren't character defects. They were experiencing normal human responses to abnormal social conditions. In the end, the samurai system collapsed, not because it was defeated by external enemies, but because it consumed itself. The contradictions between its ideological claims and practical realities became so severe that the system lost the ability to serve any useful purpose. The warrior class that supposedly existed to protect Japan became an obstacle to Japan's survival and had to be eliminated for the country to prosper. The lesson for us today is not that the individual samurai were bad people. Many were decent human beings trying to do their best within impossible circumstances. The lesson is that social systems can become so dysfunctional that they cause immense suffering even for those they claim to benefit, and that romantic mythology can obscure social realities that desperately need to be recognized and addressed. The samurai believed they were living honorable lives in service to their society, but history has judged them differently. They were, in fact, participants in a system of organized violence, economic exploitation, and social oppression that caused enormous suffering for themselves and others. Their story is not one to be celebrated, but one to be learned from. A cautionary tale about the dangers of rigid social hierarchies, the destructiveness of honor cultures, and the human cost of systems that prioritize abstract ideals over human welfare. As the morning sun rises over Sengakuji Temple and the 47 Ronin complete their ritual suicides, their blood mingles with that of countless other samurai who died for a system that never deserved their sacrifice. Their deaths mark not the triumph of honor over adversity, but the final collapse of a social order that had outlived any useful purpose it might once have served. In their tragedy, we see reflected the larger tragedy of the entire samurai class. People who believed they were living noble lives, but were actually trapped in a nightmare of their society's making and our own. The true horror of samurai life wasn't that it was physically dangerous or economically precarious. It was that it convinced intelligent, capable, well-meaning people to waste their lives in service to a system that caused enormous suffering while producing nothing of lasting value. That, perhaps, is the most damning indictment of all. Not that the samurai were evil, but that they were good people, whose goodness was corrupted and ultimately destroyed by the very system they died trying to serve.